Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Polititeam Podcast. I'm your host, Raymond Hennessy. Now, today's format of episode will be slightly different than usual. As you can see, I don't have a guest with me. It's just me up here. However, behind the camera, I do have our producer, Miles Moorfield.
What's up, guys? It's Miles, the man behind the camera.
Yes. So, today's episode is going to be a different format than usual. I'm going to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart, something that I find very interesting that maybe you guys won't as much. And for that reason, I have Miles here to basically keep me in check, make sure I don't yap too hard, and also maybe draw it back in whenever I go a little too deep. And the topic I want to talk about today is art history, especially that of the role of architecture, modern art, and the political implications that it has with the world today.
And for some context, guys, I know nothing about art. Well, to say nothing is a bit of an understatement. I know that there's a color wheel and you pick that, and red and blue is Republican and Democrat. But besides that, I could not tell you the difference between any of the stuff Ray's about to talk about.
You ever heard of complementary colors?
Yeah, I have. I've been looking at those for like fashion advice. I've been trying to up my game, so I think that's where I'm going to go with that.
Great. So I think as important to start off and also to make it somewhat interesting is I want to start with the political implications of art and architecture. Because in the modern day, I think a lot of people view art not merely as a form of expression, but also as a form of activism, as a form of conveying a message or a point. I think there's a whole rise of this thing called like activist art. You see this going down from, for example, graffiti, whether or not graffiti's art.
Yeah, like Banksy, right?
Like Banksy, which it's a whole nother conversation whether or not he's been institutionalized. And the point of him has been completely, that's another lecture for another day. But then also things from large sculptural, there's this artist named Roy Lichtenstein. And during the Vietnam era, he created a tank with a giant lipstick that pointed out of it. And the point of that art was a commentary on the Vietnam War, kind of glossing and sexifying it up when really it's a very violent, gruesome thing, the Vietnam War. I meant to say it's the Vietnam War. What's, I think, most important, though, is architecture. Out of the forms of art that we like to think of, when it comes to art, we think of, I think, drawing, sculpting, and architectural design. That being how we build things. Architecture is the most important when it comes to society. And that's because architecture is
Wait. Hold up. The most important for society? You're saying it matters how we build the houses that we house people in?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
It does.
Okay.
And I'll say this, it's because architecture is one of the few forms of art that constantly impresses itself upon you. When it comes to a piece of art, for example, a painting, you have to go up to the art and you have to look at it, you have to see it, and you can walk away from it. Architecture, though, you're trapped in it. Look at this room that we're in. This is our environment. It has an effect on you. There's a reason why, for example, at our school, our college, Gelman Library is so hated. Because of its design, its architecture.
Well, fun fact, I read a piece on the architecture design of most like college libraries, right? Mm-hmm. And the reason they look so depressing is sad is because the administration after the Vietnam War protests were like, we need to make sure no students can get in here ever. So they that's why there's only one entrance. Like, think of it, makes no sense.
Yes, it doesn't make sense, but I'll tell you why it happened. Because we went from going from classical ideas of architecture and design. There was a quote by Vitruvius, and he was a Roman architect and engineer during the 1st century BC, and he had a quote, firmitas, utilitas, and venustas, which means function, structure, beauty. And that was the guiding principle of architecture for hundreds and hundreds of years, and it only changed recently with the creation of capital M modern art. Louis Sullivan was one of the initial founders of the modern art movement. He said that he coined form follows function. The idea that things should be created not for the sake of design, but should be created to do what it's meant to do. So,
I can agree with that point. That does make sense on paper. Like, I walk around airports sometimes and I see all these fancy designs, but I'm still waiting hours in line in TSA, and I'm like, why have all this glass outside when instead I could have 10 more lanes with the space available for me to get through TSA faster?
Yeah, I would say something like when you go to an airport, they're a really good example of this kind of modern art, not modern architecture. These very glass-centric, metallic creations that are very, I would use the term abstract. You see, for example, compared to Union Station, everything's very grounded, hard. You have the pillars made out of marble and stone. You have the statues. You have a feeling that it's very much grounded, if that makes sense. When you go to an airport, for example, it's created after the idea of flying up into the sky, being light like a bird. It's this glass kind of almost mixing in the outside and the inside world. However, the idea of design possibly obstructing the function is not necessarily the focus here, of the sense of like form follows function. That's not necessarily the focus, but the example would be this. When you're driving down the highways and you see the light posts that come up and over the highways that light up and illuminate the highways, what do you see? It's a piece of metallic going up and a piece of metallic going to the side, and then there's a light and it comes down. It's very simple. That's an example of form follows function. It was designed for a very specific function, and you do the bare minimum to make it work. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. That adds up, Like, I worked in a restaurant, and I'd say restaurants generally would any business, actually, I think, besides like the uppity ones, basically follows.
The uppity ones.
Well, yeah, like when you're walking into like a cat cafe and suddenly like there's a cat mural, or you're like walking in between like a statue of a cat. Like, I don't know. That's a very far-fetched example, but you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, and it's not that exactly the concept of form follows function is always wrong or it's always bad. It's very economical in many cases. There is a use for it, and there is a context for it. The issue that appears in the more modern times is kind of this attempted tyranny of modernism. And I use the term tyranny of modernism very purposefully because there are many aspects of capital M modernism, which I think is important to distinguish capital M and lowercase m.
What are you talking about?
Yes. So the modern art movement, when we think of modern art, we think of Piet Mondrian. We think of like those paintings.
Warhol?
Warhol was more pop art. He was like walking into modern art, but slightly before. But you ever see the painting of like, it's like a canvas and it's like there's white with the black lines and there's some red and yellow and there's like the squares of that design. Or modern art or here's a classic example of modern art. We don't think about it, but this is modern architecture, is the glass skyscrapers that are just made of all glass panels that you see like lining all the cities throughout the world.
Oh, yeah. That like that big one in London where it's like the spiral or
that's
whatever?
Like international design. That's the term that it's called. And that spurred out of the modern architecture, modern art movement. And what you find is that they have basically tried, or the proponents of modern art, capital M modern, have tried to capture the term modern by calling this form of art capital M modern, as if they have a monopoly over the term, as if you can't go beyond it. This is the apex of what modernity is. Do you understand that?
Yeah, it's basically like, okay, like in layman's term, it'd be like, okay, I come up with a new book, right? And I call the book the modern book, right? And it's like reinvented the book game, right? Mm-hmm. And I tell everybody, this is the only way we can write books, so therefore it's the best book, right?
Yes. And inherently, it's very, there's many factors to it. It's very chauvinistic. It's this idea that you have reached the end of what design and what art and architecture is supposed to be. And that everything before was pre-modern, and you have brought forth the new era that is to be kept. Not even that this modern era is for today, but it's forever.
But is that to say like there aren't like currently like post-modern, that's the wrong word, but like things that happened after modern art or modern architecture? Mm-hmm. Or is this theory hinging on the fact that that is impossible due to the tyranny of modernity?
Well, the theory is that it's not impossible, because I would argue that their attempts to be tyrannical over art will fail. It was a movement the idea of this tyrannical modern was in full swing in the later 20th century, and we're still in it, but it's slowly starting to go away. they're slowly starting to lose because it's an impossible battle to win. Modern art is inherently revolutionary because what it did was it took all the values and the thinking of historical art and radically made a departure of it. So much so that they even changed the lexicon surrounding modern art. There's a lot of different ways at the fundamental level that the proponents of capital M modern art tried to fundamentally change what art and architecture was to capture what art meant.
So
and it's something that's not working.
You're talking about like changing the lexicon, right? Like,
Yes.
are you saying this in like the pseudo intellectual sphere
No.
of academics, or like, is my friend who's going to become an architecture only going to be able to talk like a modern architect would, and versus like his granddad 200 years ago?
To an extent, the vocabulary has been changed, and I'll give this example. A lot of the modern architects of the time, Le Corbusier is another one, they all wrote manifestos of what modern art was supposed to be. And they use vocabulary that's very pernicious and over the long term had very serious effects on how we view architecture. And this might be something that as layman to architecture, you wouldn't be like, this makes no sense. But for those who study architecture, these are terms that are commonly used. For example, they use terms such as Le Corbusier's purism, as if there's a purity to having a certain way of having architecture done. Or the idea that there are clean designs, like, oh, this was a very cleanly created building, or organic or natural.
But aren't you guys just like extrapolating a lot from a bunch of words? Like, because when I think of like a clean design, I'm thinking like it's all glass and it's sleek and shiny and I can like see everything because the inside's pure.
But why? What gave you what made you decide those words?
Whoa, damn.
Why is that the definition of purity?
Well, like, isn't that what purity is about? You know, being honest and true.
So is that what purity is about? Or has that been the ideological capture of the modern artists, the modern architectures?
Are you saying I'm like a sheep right now? Did they get to me right?
What I'm saying is that they had profound influence for decades in architecture.
And I'm
only
the victim? We're the victim?
many of us are victims. A lot of the basic presumptions we have about architecture and design have been presumptions that were created in the modernist capture of what art and architecture was. And only recently have we started stepping back from it and realizing that they do not have the monopoly over the terms we use and how we view what is created.
Man, now you're sounding like you got a manifesto right now. But like, okay, so hypothetically, if everything you're saying is adding up and it's all correct, right, and we live under this tyrannical state where even my ideas are controlled by the architect deep state, right?
The architect deep state, yes.
Like, because when I think about where I want to live somewhere where my house looks pretty. I've got a clean road and I can walk to a supermarket, you know?
Right.
How does like the way we use words to describe architecture impacting my like day-to-day existence?
Right. So it's not necessarily the way we use words. The words was just the example to show how embedded these thoughts into your mind. And these words represent theories. These words represent notions of design. They are reflections of the modernist view of the world. And what we do is when we internalize them, it's harder to combat them. And I'll give this example. During the 1970s and 80s, a lot of classical buildings, classically designed buildings, were being torn down and replaced with new modern architecture because they viewed the modern architecture as the pure architecture, the new art for the new era. And so because of that, when we have these types of terms that point towards one form of style being the future, we are basically corralling everything into one way. And that to fight against it is to basically be inherently some primitive revolt against it. And I'll say this. I think there is a reason why you see throughout a lot of the country, things have gone to... There's the terms like the gentrified look of things. Like when you go around, buildings look the same everywhere you go.
Yeah. I think it's perfectly encapsulated by like the gentrified Mexican place that looks the same in any somewhat burgeoning like suburb anywhere. You've got the mural on the wall, you've got like the dark paint, like dark ambiance, and like the really bad mood lighting.
Or, for example, when you look through the skylines of every city in the world, you see the same looking kind of glass skyscrapers. The diversity is within the shapes of the skyscrapers, but you start seeing this convergence of design, this cultural convergence. And I think that is because of modern architecture saying that there is one way forward. There's no longer a look towards as much of like local design, local style. And such things are starting to make a comeback, but for a long time, they were being destroyed.
But isn't that just like a byproduct of like globalization? Like think about it, like the West, God, I might be talking about out my ass here, but like I would imagine, the first skyscrapers were in what, like New York City, right?
The first skyscraper was it might have been Chicago or Detroit.
Okay.
It was one of the. It was a U.S. city.
Yeah,
though.
yeah. So like it starts in the U.S., right, and then we become like the world superpower, and everybody's trying to be like us, right, and like get their money. So why, like, I get what you're saying, but a part of me just wants to say, well, isn't this all just happens chance?
I think this is inherently different than, for example, other forms of cultural convergence. Whether or not people like baseball or I don't know, Babe Ruth, The difference is that there's a very chauvinistic definitive argument that regardless of whether or not who is in control, this is beyond culture. This is a matter of almost hard science. We have reached pure architecture. We have reached definitive architecture. We have reached the architecture, the way of building that is most quote unquote organic. And that regardless of whatever happens, this is the only way. When it comes to, example, copying a cultural hegemon, things are apt to change, even within the cultural hegemon. This, however, claims that it's unchanging. It is beyond humanity. This is something almost ethereal that they are touching upon, and that is simply not the case. And the reason why this kind of thinking comes about is this idea that it's this incorrect notion that basically every era has a new aesthetic, or every era has a different vibe or style. It comes from a fundamental mischaracterization of history. When we look at history, we like to neatly divide up eras. This was this era, this was that era, this was this time.
Oh yeah, man, I know. I play those strategy games.
Yeah.
I know
like
when I'm
Civ
reaching.
6, you know. But and then we like to think that with each era there was different forms of art. You had the Romanesque era, then you had the Gothic style, then you had this style, then that style. But that's inherently a falsehood. This need for constantly driving for this capital M modern style is inherently a never-ending, fruitless endeavor, because everything that is created within a certain time or scope is reflective of the people inherently. It's this notion that we always need to keep striving for new, for this concept of what was better than the past, when in reality, whatever we create, no matter what style, it is ours. Even if we were to take the style of, for example, a Romanesque chapel from like the style of like the 11th century, when we create it and we add our own little spin to it by our own personal little aesthetic choices, we have inherently created something that is our own, not of the past.
Like, yeah, but also like think about it this way. All those buildings were like really expensive and like really tedious to build, no? Like in modernism, right? Like glass and all that stuff is like somewhat not easy. My grandfather was a glass worker, like he built some of those skyscrapers and stuff. But like objectively, right, is it not like cheaper for us all to adopt one style? Like you talk about like this idea of ownership, like really like nobody owned you own that building because you like built it, your community built it.
Yes, but Miles, it's also cheaper to always wear a white t-shirt and gray pants every day for the rest of your life. Human life is not meant to be purely economical, where you choose the cheapest, most simplest designs.
Hey, I know some people in the economic department who would disagree with that.
And they got some serious problems, okay? The truth of the matter is, people don't want to live in a purely economical world. We live in a world in which we like splendor. We like having more than. It's this idea that, all we need is to create these same looking homes. You're going to have your own. You will have your cube with a bed and you will be happy. With all this like faux pas abstract art. That's not necessarily true. People want embellishment. They see beauty. There's a reason why people go, for example, to Florence every year to see the beauty of the city. There is something inherent.
And the pasta.
And the pasta. But it's not that people. I don't like the I disagree fundamentally with the argument that just because something is cheaper, people will converge to it. If that's
But I guess, like, you know, think about splendor. Like, you talk about splendor. Like, splendor for all of, like, human history, for the most part, has been utilized to, like, worship, if not God worship, either actual gods or humans that we were forced to believe are gods, you know?
That's not true.
What?
That's not true. You're telling me when we talk about splendor, for example, if I have a nice portrait embellishing over my fireplace, or if, for example, if I have a building,
I was talking about architectural.
okay, then
splendor
architecturally,
here. Yes.
yeah, then architecturally, if I want my house to have a certain design, for example, if I want to have vaulted arches, for example, because I think they look pretty, it's my prerogative to have that. Rather than just have
but
a
it's
square
also
frame.
just like a subtle flex to be like, "Yo, dog, I just spent like 10K on this. Y'all broke as hell."
But it's
like to
not-
be so for real. No,
but it
like,
varies.
When I walk into like my friend's house, their parents, they love to tell me all about their renovations and exactly how much they cost. You know what I mean?
It's not about the cost. It's about the social. I'll use the term social capital. This is what you earn, like in the soul from it. For example, living in a dreary square apartment is depressing. There's a reason why no one wants to live at that for the rest of their lives.
I would counter that. I stayed in a very nice ex-Soviet like hostel that was in a very depressing square building, and I would say that I still found it enjoyable.
For how long?
Well, okay, 3 days.
Okay.
You might have me there.
What I'm saying is, even in, like, for example, your bedroom, in your dorm room, for example, right? Do you just have a bare, empty room, or do you like to add up, spruce it up?
Yeah, spruce it up here and there.
And that kind of same mentality also goes with architecture. It doesn't have to be grandiose things, for example. And this is actually one of the great innovations of the American architecture to the world, is that we have democratized, the lights flashed, we have democratized almost a splendor. For example, you look at the New York brownstones. How much design is in the New York brownstone that a common man lives in? Well, not common anymore. Not common anymore. Used to be common. Used to be common,
I was
man.
like, I see those brownstone renovations on TikTok,
Yes.
and that's like millions of dollars.
But they were for relatively common men at the time of their creation.
But at that time, were they like, damn, this brownstone's so unique? They were like, nah, I'm really poor. You know, at the end of the day, I think it goes down to like,
no, it's more than that. It's more than that, because more than just economics, and I think this is an issue that we look at sometimes. There's more than the material aspect to it. It's the soul. It's the spiritual. When we look at beautiful things, we feel good inside. When we look at a barren room, we feel nothing. If we look at it long enough, we feel depressed. There is an inherent mental side to viewing beautiful things, and because of that, it's important that we spread beautiful things.
okay, I agree with that on like paper, right? You know, I too feel beautiful things. I, you know, get all the butterflies when I walk into an old Italian chapel, you know. But I guess my question is, okay, so architecture has moved, in my opinion, to like a standardized procedure, a standardized way of doing things that your theory would say is based on modernism, right?
The push towards this standardization and one way of doing things has been capital M modernism.
Yes. And I agree with that. Like, I see those Instagram posts where it's like the anti-homelessness benches and like the really sad, depressing like English downtowns that like lose all their charm. But like, what am I supposed to do about that, dude? Because like, yeah, I want to customize my home, but like what are we gonna do about it? Because clearly it's like I don't know, the vibes.
But see, that's the most important thing. It is the vibes. What you build and how you build it sets the vibe of an environment. And being members of the community, we have to realize that, quite honestly, when something ugly goes up, if it's here's the thing that we have to realize, and this
Like
is,
we're
I think,
protesting? You want me to start
no,
protesting?
not necessarily,
and-
but you have to, like, what people don't realize is that when you build, for example, a building, you're not just building the building for the people who live in it. You're building the building for everyone who walks around it and lives around it. Everyone, like I said before, architecture is the only form of art that imposes itself upon you. You are always affected by the architecture that is around you. And because of that, I don't think it's right for us to just go idly by and say, oh, they're going to build this giant, I don't know. I wish I could show images. There are some really, really ugly architecture that was built in the name of modernism. And this is not to say, by the way, let me make this very clear. It's not that all modern art is bad. There are certain, very like glass structures that are beautiful and well done. But there are many works that I think are also not well done. And a lot of it is not done. And when the exception is not the rule, we should disregard the rule. I think a lot of modern architecture ends up being not appealing and ends up being extraordinarily unspectacular. And it's not that architecture has to be spectacular. It's just that it's dreary. It's repetitive. There's nothing new to it. But going back, I felt like I want to make that clear. I'm not against the idea of a glass skyscraper or some degree of modern art. I just do think that the overprevalence.
You just want it like with diversity.
I think it's important to have diversity. Yes, beautiful diversity. And although you could say what is beauty, it's like the term.
Yeah, aren't you using just like the old standards of like what is considered beautiful?
But see, the old standards, they are open and flexible. The modern system is rigid and strict.
Yeah, so I guess it's like a flipping of your head of your like traditional like conservative, like
in a weird sense, the conservative
rigidness.
No, but in a weird way, the conservative way was more liberal, if that makes sense.
Yes, in the architectural
world, the conservative view of art is more liberal. It encompasses more because conservative architecture, the view of it doesn't make these claims of monopoly on purism, on what is organic. Instead, it has principles. And from those principles, it's kind of like structuring, it's kind of like writing a sentence with grammatical structure. Yes, there are some rules that bind you when you create sentences, but it ends up allowing you to create such a wide plethora of sentences and stories. It ends up becoming very enabling, in a sense.
So rules free us is what I'm getting.
To a certain extent, for example, we could not communicate with one another if we didn't follow, like, lexiconic rules of lexicon.
Yeah.
But because of the certain rules, we're able to create, for example, beautiful works of art and dialogue. In a way,
yeah,
the
like
rules...
Hawktua.
Yes.
That's a beautiful use of lexicon right there.
True. Think about it. Without lexiconic rules, we would not have to talk to a podcast.
Exactly.
Which is outperforming us by miles.
Facts. We need some of their magic in here.
True. But it's for that reason, I think that modern architecture is so damaging. It is actually the tyrannical view of art and architecture. It is the oppressive, I'll say. It is the oppressive view of how art should be done. And it's that turning away that makes it better. And I'll give another example of using here's another thing. Modern art likes to turn away from the past. It looks at everything done in the past and says no because it's prehistoric. But when you have the classical view of art and architecture, you look towards the past and you're able to create even better. Moby Dick, for example. Maybe you don't like that book, but it was heavily based off stories from the Bible. And using those stories from the Bible, he was able to create a masterpiece of his time. Or I'll even get the Apocalypse Now, that movie.
That's a good movie.
It was heavily based off of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. A lot of the times, you can use inspiration from the past and create even better. And it's not a matter of if I copy the past, I am nothing more than just copying the past. You have created something of your time. It is a work of our time. And that this long lineage has enabled work to even grow better.
But who's to say that modern art's just... Well, actually, no, you answer that. That makes sense. You make sense.
I'm making sense? This is great.
Yes.
I didn't think I'd get this far.
Do I understand art now? Am I prepared?
Well, it's not a matter of understanding art. And it's weird because it's paradoxical. I'm sounding like I'm arguing for a more conservative view of it, but also I'm arguing for a very much more liberal understanding view of art. You have to understand that art is a lot more relative. It's relational. It's not a strict set of rules that modern art likes to claim it to be.
Yeah, okay. I agree with all this, right? But I do... So if we're just talking about art here, like I find like modern art that's in a park that brings people together and community, I feel like that's a better purpose of art than, say, the art that's in museums, that's behind a paywall. You know, I feel like I like very much grew up in a place where like local architecture and stuff like and art was like very important and very localized and garnered community and stuff.
Yeah, so I think you look at art in a very kind of social function. What is its social function? Which it is important to kind of view art in that sense, how it makes people react and feel in relation.
Well, isn't that your whole point with the architecture stuff?
Yes, no, it is. And I this is why I say it's very different from architecture is very different from art, for example, because you have to go to a museum to see art, for example, or you see a mural on the wall, but architecture, it's constantly around you, no matter what. You will never escape architecture the way you can walk away from a painting. You can't just walk away from a building, especially if you're living in one. You can't be inside an art piece, but you could be inside architecture, which is why architecture, I think, is so much more important, if that makes sense. But also, I'll say this. One of the fundamental things of architecture and art and sculpting is that for a long time, these three things were together as one. You look at the classical buildings. For example, have you ever been to the Renwick Gallery?
No.
It's like across the street from the White House.
Dude, I've been to like the Art History Museum, and that's about like this museum in Atlanta that I'd go on dates with girls and act like I knew what I was talking about. That was a good time. Yo, bro, like, you know, there are people like you who actually are pretentious about art, and then there are people like me who just act like they're pretentious.
The difference, though, is I don't have girls coming with me to museums,
yeah,
unfortunately.
Yeah. I guess that does fundamentally explain why you have so much time to learn about art.
It seems like you have one or the other. You either you can't have both when going to a museum. But when you look at the more classical pieces of architecture, you would see that buildings that were classically designed were not only architecturally created, but they had sculptures incorporated into them. They had artistry that was incorporated. It wasn't strictly just a building. For example, this room that we're in right now, what do you see? You see strict flat walls, and what do you call these things? Like a false ceiling?
Yeah, like the fake tile ceilings that are in like all the offices that all the depressed people work at.
Right. There's very little architecture. There's very little artistry in this room. For example, even having when I was growing up in my room, when I was like a young child, we had these little strips of something I forgot they're called. You put it up around the corners of your room.
Oh yeah, it's like crown molding or something.
And it
like
made
that.
it look like there was at least some little arch design that you could look at, like some pattern design. You know?
Yeah.
Something as small as that.
No, me and my girlfriend like talk about that, you know, in terms of like how we want to decorate our own home. You know, like I think about the fact that like, yeah, I don't want it all to look the same. But then from a like societal standpoint, you know, like I'm a really big proponent for like affordable housing, you know. And I agree that, you know, low income people deserve to live in beautiful spaces, but you also have to find a way to house a bunch of people for like relatively inexpensive so that certain people and certain political parties don't get really mad at certain expenditures.
No, I completely understand that. But I'll say this. When it comes to creating beautiful, you're not just, and this would be my argument for those who say it's purely for cheap reasons, you're not just influencing, for example, those who live in the housing, you're influencing the entire community at large. So, for example, let's say I quarter off a section of the city, and I say, there's going to be a bunch of low-income housing, and we build the exact same looking, gentrified, like real simple buildings, right? Over and over again.
I know what you're talking about.
That whole area is going to be very visually distinct from the rest of the city that might have been created during a time of more visual splendor, I'll put it that way. And then mentally, we're going to even more further reinforce the idea that it should be quartered off in our minds.
No,
but on top of that, it fosters an environment of like almost doomerism and defeatism. Like, I live in the ugly, like boring part of the city. Like, I think people deserve to live in a beautiful place.
Yeah, I think that actually makes a lot of sense. Like when I was in Vienna, God, it's like my Europe world tour is this episode. But I was in Vienna, right, and we were staying in like the Turkish district where a bunch of Turkish immigrants lived. If you've never been to Vienna, that place is beautiful in every other part of the city except the Turkish district, in which it was all this like brutal, well, I don't even know what brutalistic means, but like, you know, like these dreary like apartment units. That was a sad sad day.
No, it is sad, and I think it
Good
reinforces.
kebabs, very good kebabs.
But I think that reinforces this kind of mental divide between kind of my community and your community. And also, I think it mentally wears on the people who live there. Think about it. If you're living in a not pretty part of the city and everyone else is living in a much beautiful part, you can grow resentful of that. I would grow resentful of that. Why am I denied the beauty that the rest of the city has? And I think, therefore, it's a duty, not just the people living there, but for the entire community to be, as a policy, building beautifully. And I think that there's going to be unexpected and it's going to be incalculable, but there will be a return on investment for putting more in building beautifully. Because I think when you build beautifully, you surround people by beautiful things. People will be more uplifted. They'll be more willing. They'll be more energetic and enthused. I do believe that. When I walk through New York City and I walk through some of the not nice parts of it that are run down, I have a very different feeling than when I walk through some of the more beautiful architecturally designed parts. And it's not just me being some guy coming from the nice part of the city. I think it's something that anyone would feel. It has a toll.
No, that makes sense, right? I think like I would actually like guarantee you there are a bunch of social science papers out there in the world that probably dictate this exact phenomenon occurring, you know. But okay, again, it comes down to like a basing of like resources, you know, because these communities that don't have anything, bro, like they're just gonna try to build something.
So when we say we don't have anything, the way we always build architecture was you take local materials from the area and you build with that. Now we're shipping in all this stuff from around the world to build the same looking buildings throughout the entire world. Like before
like,
we had
before we had the ability, stop globalization.
Before we had the ability to ship glass and steel and all that stuff from across the world, people weren't building in mass with the local materials that they had. I would argue that, you know, if that's really the world we live in, then, you know, if that's the world you want to live in, and I make this argument over and over again, it's not just about the economics. Yes, economics is to be considered, but if you want to be purely economical about things, and you want to have just purely a bunch of the same looking houses throughout the entire world, and they all look like the same building block pattern, let that be the life you live. But that's not the life I think would be most beneficial to society.
Okay, valid. Okay, so you've got all these critiques for the modernist, you know, all these critiques for my economic arguments. So what's your solution, or not solution, but what does like these people who agree with you, what do they have to say about how we fix it? Or is it just like, again, what you're saying, like doom and gloom, and we're just on a death loop towards cubicles?
So I do believe that people, I do believe it's not doom and gloom, because for example, even if it's the most economical option, we don't want to be in a cubicle. Like, there's a really strong reason why there's a consensus among a lot of the youth. It's like, we don't want that lifestyle in a really, really ugly gray cubicle working.
Like, personally, I'm trying to like work out of my van and like van life across the country.
You do you, bro.
What?
But that's not a gray, dreary office building now, is it?
True. I was thinking like more like California coast, a little bit of like the Rockies in there.
Nature's architecture.
Oh God, is it?
I don't think architecture would be the right term, because architecture
Well,
implies
no, I'm
like,
pretty.
you know,
Well, I think religious people would say it's like God's architecture.
yeah, you could just say it's nature's blessings, you know.
Facts. Keeping things apolitical here on Polytune.
But I'll say this: it's the notion that the proponents of modernism, what they try to do is basically create this like forever revolution that you can never look back. But the people, there is an inherent drive in people to want diversity. No one wants, like, for example, why do we go to Florence? Because it looks different than a lot of the other modern like buildings.
Okay, yes.
Okay, and also, what are the steps moving forward to actually turn away from this? I think it's going back to building with local materials rather than shipping. This is the first step one, building with local materials that we have. And of course, that also includes shipping in certain materials. But that doesn't mean you ship the same concrete from China, you take the same glass that's manufactured from another part of China, and then you put it together, and now you have the building.
This is sounding like an awfully political argument you're proposing.
Well, no, it's simply a fact. For example, why was there so much architectural diversity throughout the world? Because people built with the materials that they had around them. That's why the cities, besides cultural differences, that's why fundamentally the cities of Japan look different than the cities of China, or well, they look more similar, but the cities of France versus the cities of the U.S. because we built with local materials and we had our own design, and from that we created beauty from it.
So what you're saying is Trump's 100% tariff is how I save my community from
Here's
looking
the
like an
move.
office
Here's the move.
building.
You buy into local lumber mills, local mining companies, and you sell your stock in like foreign Chinese like glass and construction, and you go big with me on locally built classical architecture.
God, now this is the sales pitch, man. I think we have a genius business idea formulated here.
And then think about it. With your increased stock prices, you could now live in a pretty house, a pretty home.
Like, this is an argument.
I genuinely do believe that when you look at, for example, the colonial style of housing, like the colonial house, right?
Like the type in like New England
Yeah,
and
like
stuff
those.
with like the really ugly pillars and stuff.
Okay, well you could think they're ugly, but they're uniquely American. They are uniquely American.
That is true.
And why were they uniquely American? Because they were built with the materials of the local materials, and then as a result, people learned to get beautiful with them, to get designful of them. We don't do that when we all use the same materials and we all aspire to the same kind of nebulous, pure. It's almost a Puritanism, like this Puritanism of art, of design. I think it starts back with one, ridding the idea of just having these pure thoughts. Instead, it's relative. We have to look back at ourselves and look at the architecture that we have genuinely inherited and not been forced, and build from there.
Yeah. Like, here's the thing, Ray. I agree with everything you're saying. I now somewhat understand what you're saying. However, as like a young person, right, I can already like barely afford rent. You know, I already struggle. There are already so many political causes that deserve my time. And also, like, another thing I don't get is like, when I look at least like architecture and urban planning, I'm often looking at like the 15-minute city, right? Mm-hmm. And the 15-minute city, I feel like if I just have more community around me, does it really matter if the buildings are ugly?
I think it does. I think it does. I think that when you look at... I think it does because it fundamentally changes your mindset in subconscious ways. I'll give this example. In prisons, they use a certain color shade of pink because it statistically proves that it decreases the rates of violent actions occurring between inmates. There are a lot of ways that architecture, design, artistry subconsciously change the way you view and interact with people. And I think that when people are in a nicer environment, people tend to behave well with each other. I mean, it's even the example of like the rat paradise.
Huh.
Okay, so they did this experiment with rats where they basically gave them like a paradise or whatever, and they like let them like breed and stuff and like crazy. And when
doing rat things.
Yeah, and when the communities basically when the paradise started getting like really dirty and discovered and tight, they started acting a lot more violent with one another. But when it was open and clean, the rats were acting a lot more like kind with one another, a lot less hostile. I think it's similar for humans. For example, like more than just economic factors, I think living in the slums when you're living in filth and dirt is not conducive to a good mentality when interacting with your fellow man. So it is more than just a community atmosphere.
I don't know if that's entirely the reason why.
But I think it's an aspect. It's not entirely the reason.
Yeah, it's an aspect that has nothing to do with architecture and everything to do with like poorly funded public services in those communities.
It does have something to do with architecture. When you look at those slums that are all run down and destroyed and there's no beauty to them, it's not the only factor. There are a plethora of factors, but it doesn't help. And I think that if you live with a community of people and you live in a really disgusting and ugly area, it has an effect on you.
Maybe I'll give you that point. Maybe I'll agree.
And I'll say this. I think that I think this will be like kind of my closing remark on what we can do as the youth.
Yes.
And it's not that we as youth, we try to think really, really big, that we can make an extreme change tomorrow. But the truth of the matter is that because of all the systems in place and the structures, we can't do that realistically. But what we can start doing is making small changes at the localities and then build up from there. It starts with just talking about architecture, planting the seeds in our fellow generation and those before and after us that maybe what's happening, the trends that we're facing are not desirable. And this is something that people aren't even thinking about. This is something that we should start getting people to think about. And then make small changes. Maybe advocate for, at the local level, let's say the town hall is getting renovations, advocate for a certain style of renovations. I'm not saying become super educated and learn the difference between, like the Art Nouveau style versus, neoclassicist. But make certain recommendations to it. We don't want just another windowed, metal building. And then from there on, it's about advocacy, creating an association that advocates for this stuff.
Yeah, I'd agree with that stuff. Like, I was on the master planning committee for like my Parks and Rec in my hometown, and it was cool. It's definitely like empowering to be able to like impact the way your city will physically look. We were about to get parks on top of skyscrapers, dude. It was gonna be sick. I was very excited. Still hasn't happened yet, but we're waiting on it. Bureaucracy's working.
The bureaucracy is another thing. Wait until my next episode where I have a bureaucracy rant for 2 hours. But no. That being said, thank you all for listening, and the next episode will not be about a bureaucracy rant, don't worry. But thank you all. Thank you all for listening to another episode of the Polititeen podcast. Miles, I want to say thank you for keeping me grounded during this conversation.
Yeah, what can I say? I try. Thanks for having me on. Well, I guess I had myself on since I do produce it, but I'm on.
All right, and we thank you for listening. I'd like to thank our researchers, Michael Schur and Trex Jones. This episode was brought to you by the Ox Institute. For more information with them, follow them at oxinstitute.org.